exploring different places to emigrate. And he just told me that it's sunny and warm all year long in Lithuania, just like it is right now. I'm not sure he was completely telling you the truth, but it certainly is nice to visit. I'm here to talk about why competition between governments is desirable. And so in some sense, this is a process discussion. What is it? What does it mean? How do governments compete with each other? And what does it lead to? And is it a desirable thing? Of course, my answer is that it is very desirable. We should start by first outlining what gives us prosperity. And in some sense, a few of these issues have been touched on already. And some of these various indexes from around the world have been talked about. But I think they all tell a very similar story. You have to have a good foundation. If you have the rule of law, property rights, and sound money, you're way ahead of the game. And then, and I sort of view those things as the foundation. So if you're building a house, you have to have a good foundation no matter what. If you have a crummy foundation, you can have the prettiest house in the world, but it's not going to last very long. And so some of these conditions that you find in these various indexes around the world, they're very, very important. And then the policies, your taxes, your spending, your regulation, your labor policy, those are like the house. And obviously you want both of them if you want your economy to be more competitive. And what does it really mean to have a competitive economy? This is ultimately all about what's going to give the people of a nation the highest possible living standards, the best opportunities to improve their lives. And from the perspective of someone who works at a think tank, obviously we focus a lot on what the role of government policy is. And there's obviously many, many areas of economic policy, but just a few of the main ones. Taxation. How does the government take the money from us, and in what form do they take it? Some taxes have worse effects than others. Spending. Once government takes the money, what are they doing with it? And there are different types of spending that have different economic impact. Some types of government spending actually help an economy, but an awful lot of government spending actually undermines economic performance. And then what about regulation? Well, the challenge with regulation is there's usually costs and benefits. And the challenge is, can you make sure that the benefits exceed the cost? And oftentimes, especially when we're talking about competition between governments, from the U.S. perspective, we worry that we don't do that. We have things like Sarbanes-Oxley that has driven a lot of business to Hong Kong and Bermuda and London and Zurich and other places. So we sort of shot ourselves in the foot because our policymakers were simply looking at, well, here are the benefits on this side of the equation. And of course, they probably exaggerated them, but they didn't look at all the costs that they were putting on the other side of the equation. And then, of course, things like monetary policy and some of the others, labor policy, that we can talk forever about these things, but it's simply important to realize that when you're talking about government and you're talking about competition, one thing that's very important to keep in mind is that you have to focus on the fact that there are other governments out there. And if your policymakers make mistakes, that's going to rebound to the benefit of other nations who will roll out the red carpet, as we say in the U.S. They'll roll out the red carpet and try to attract the entrepreneurs and the investors that otherwise would have come to your country if the mistakes weren't being made. Now, the challenge is, when looking at these various issues of government policy and whether the burden of government is too big or not, we have what's called the public choice challenge. And public choice is a school of economic thought that was popularized around the world, governments have gotten smaller. That's the good news. The bad news is governments tend to only get smaller after they first made a lot of mistakes and got very, very big. So I'm not quite sure that one would ever want to allow your government to double in size so you can then cut it by 25%. You're still worse off at the end of the day. So the challenge is, given that politicians have an incentive to have a bigger government, and given the fact that we know from all the academic research that's out there, all the cross-country comparisons, we know that generally speaking, it's better to have a more modest burden of government. How do we get the politicians to do the right thing? Especially when sometimes, when they want to get elected to office, they like to sort of divide the population by pitting one group against another. And we see this in tax policy in the U.S. all the time. You have some politicians who want to demagogue against the rich. Oh, we need the rich to pay more in tax and the rest of us can have more. But of course, they're only looking again at one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is, well, if you raise taxes, what's going to happen? Will those rich people earn as much money? Will they report their income? Will they move their income out of the country? So again, that's a challenge. How do you get politicians to do the right thing? And this, of course, is where competition between governments is so critically important. I oftentimes say, I do all this work on tax reform and things like that in the U.S., and I oftentimes say that maybe 1% of politicians, if I'm lucky, will actually listen to what I'm saying or read a paper that I'm writing. And yet, we are seeing that there is some progress around the world, whether it's in terms of tax reform or lower tax rates, and I'll get into this in the next couple of slides. Why are some of these reforms happening? If I know that politicians aren't reading my papers or listening to what I say, why is it that some of them are doing the right thing? Well, they're doing the right thing because of globalization, and globalization is causing more competition between governments. 30, 40, 50 years ago, the vast majority of investment was internal. In other words, people saved in the country, that saving in the country was then invested in the country, and there was very little cross-border economic activity. Yeah, you had some big multinational companies and things like that, but the vast majority of economic activity was local. And what's changed, really beginning in the 1980s, is that there's an incredibly large amount now of cross-border economic activity. If you break it down into direct foreign investment and indirect foreign investment, you'll see that direct foreign investment has gone up by about 300%, measured back compared to the 1980s. Indirect foreign investment has gone up by more than 1,000%. What's the difference between the two? Direct foreign investment is when a company decides we're going to build a factory in another country. That's direct foreign investment. Indirect foreign investment is when an investor says, I'm going to buy a stock or a bond in another country. So it's more of a passive investment, but ultimately it still leads to the same thing. New economic activity being generated by the flow of resources across borders. And what this does, this really is the key in our whole presentation, is when investors and entrepreneurs, when the factors of production, as economists like to say in our boring way of talking, when the factors of production can cross borders, what does that mean? It means that governments are no longer able to exercise monopoly power. So if one government